Thank you for joining us today. The conversation will start in just a few minutes.
Thank you for joining us today as we launch our Census in the South initiative. As we navigate the coronavirus pandemic as a country, an accurate census count has never been more important. Census numbers guide the distribution of billions of dollars of federal aid, in addition to determining how many congressional seats each state will receive. As a former mayor, lieutenant governor, and state representative, I can personally attest to how important the census is. In the end, it's all about power and money. It affects important programs such as Medicaid and Head Start, as well as revenue streams for programs including community development block grants, home funding, food security, and others. We're talking about the difference between being able to adequately fund recreation or housing programs and so much more. And the census will be used to apportion political power through congressional redistricting. As we've learned from traveling across 13 southern states over the past few years, solutions to our country's most pressing challenges come from the ground up. In this inflection point for our country, that path forward must include all of us. No one can be left behind because everyone counts. Southern states lose roughly $2,500 per year on average for every person not counted in the census. And many southern communities are well behind where we were at this point in 2010. So over the next 3 months, we will be working hard with partners to make a final push to ensure that every person is counted. This census work is a critical part of our effort to ensure that our democracy represents us all. We've taken important steps to build relationships with community leaders and longtime residents of different races and socioeconomic backgrounds across dozens of communities in the South. We have learned firsthand that faith communities serve as deeply trusted sources of information and beacons of hope in times of darkness. This is what makes faith leaders' role in Census in the South campaign so critically important. We're asking faith leaders to partner with us to help encourage congregations and community partners to ensure that every person is counted. And with that, I am excited that we have Reverend Alisha Garden on our Pluribus Unum team, as well as Pastor Fred Luter on our National Advisory Committee. Pastor Luter was the first Black leader of the Southern Baptist Convention and a renowned speaker and faith leader. Reverend Alisha Garden is a native of Georgia, and she is ordained in the Baptist tradition. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, Alisha, to announce our other guests and welcome you to this wonderful conversation. Thank you all so much for joining us. Alisha, over to you.
Thanks, Mitch. Hello, everybody. So grateful that you're here with us today. Yes, I am here with Pastor Fred Luter, the former president of the Southern Baptist Convention and senior pastor of Franklin Avenue Baptist Church in New Orleans, Louisiana. I also have my good friend and sister, the Reverend Kimberly Jackson, who is the Vicar of Church of the Common Ground. And she's also the Democratic candidate for Georgia State Senate District number 41 out of Stone Mountain, Georgia. And I also have Adele London, who is a partnership specialist for the U.S. Census Bureau. I am so excited that all of you all are here. Amen. It's been a long time coming, but this is a really important and imperative conversation that we're having today. And I'm grateful for it because we are having a conversation about how faith leaders are critical to the census, but also thinking about how that partnership with community and community advocacy is so critically important. So we're going to just jump right in. All of us are Southerners, and we're Southern born and bred in some capacity. And so I would love to start with you, Adele, and hear from you about what is unique about the Southern experience, Southern culture, and history that makes participation in the census uniquely important. What is it about being a Southerner and our Southern experience and culture that makes participation in the census important?
Well, thank you again for having me. But yes, I am a Southerner, diehard New Orleanian, and it is an experience. I mean, when we talk about the South, yes, it's a geographic region, but it's also a cultural identity. There's an identity that we all have and collectively share with being from the South. And, that identity is both, there's a lot of good, there's some bad. But the history and the culture has largely been shaped by slavery. Slavery has really been the impetus and shown the impact of how we have migrated, where we live, how we live in the South. It's important to note, really, in the South, I believe in the 2010 census noted that it was over 55% of all African Americans in the United States live in the South. Wow. And it's actually it is the fastest growing region of the country. So whereas we saw in both the first and second migrations, there is now a coming back. You see people coming back to the South, a movement back there. And why? It's really about that cultural identity. It's how we live. Even though we do have those vestiges of slavery still with us, that impact our income, poverty levels, educational attainment, health and well-being disparities, all those things still exist, yet we are still tied to the soil here. Mm-hmm. And why is that? Because of our sense of family, because of our sense of place. In the South, we have this sense of place, like this is something about where we are that we just take such ownership with it. And in fact, Louisiana, I know Mississippi as well, we have probably the lowest amount of people that actually move away. And Pastor Luter can attest to this too, that it wasn't until Hurricane Katrina that many of our residents actually went outside of the state or outside of the city. So that's just how tied to the soil we are. Mm-hmm. But with that experience, the census actually poses a great opportunity. Because as Mayor Landrieu indicated earlier, it shapes and it indicates how we are represented in Congress. It shapes and indicates how much the resources and the money that we get. And we are a very needy region because of those disparities that I mentioned. We are very needy, but we don't always get those resources to come back to our cities and states. And that first starts with saying you're here, being counted in the census.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think a critical part of this conversation about living in the South, and especially your connections to slavery, is that when you think about a people who have a disjointed history, right, the census is critically important of keeping track of who's here, right? And so, a lot of us are, involved in doing ancestry.com, and a lot of the records that they use are census records. And so there's a deepening kind of historical part of our engagement that's, I think, is critically important to not only just Black Americans across this country, but in particular across the South. Thank you for that. So, Pastor Luter, I want to throw it to you. So the Black church in particular has a long history of being civically engaged in social movements for change, and has been essential in shaping the public moral narrative for our communities. I think that's a critical phrase, the public moral narrative. So where does the church find herself in this larger conversation about civic engagement and the census in 2020 in particular?
Great question. First of all, I just want to go back to the previous question that Adele addressed.
Yeah.
And the friendliest people in America are in the South. Okay, we're the friendliest people in America are in the South. I just need to put that in there. We don't even have to know you. We're going to wave at you. We're going to speak at you. I know I'm off the subject, but I was in an airport one time in Atlanta, and you know how you walking through the airport and you may see a brother or sister, you give them a nod there. And I was with this white guy who was with me, and he said, "You know that person?" I said, "No, I don't know him, but we know him." So friendliest people in the world. Now, getting to your question, Lee, the church has always been critical in getting information out to our congregation. When I was looking at the funeral yesterday with Congressman John Lewis there in the rotunda, and all week people have been talking about his impact on the African American community, dating back to his days with Dr. Martin Luther King. Those moments and those times, even from them, the church was critical in getting information out to the congregation about things that were happening in our city, in our nation, voting, who to support during elections, and all those things are critical. And so it's still critical today for churches to understand the value that we have, and particularly pastors and ministers like yourself, Reverend Jackson, myself, who have the people's ear on they will listen to us from the pulpit when they may not even turn on their TV stations and national news. So we have a voice and we have an impact in the church that we need to take advantage of. Now, the challenge today is with this pandemic, people are not in church as they normally are. So and everybody is not connected to the internet, but we still have to do our part, particularly now, because the census is so critical. And with Adele being a member of the church where I pastor, she's always on, okay, Pastor, don't forget to share with people. So it's definitely critical to let the people know about how important the census is, and the church now more than ever is critical in getting the message out.
Thank you. Reverend Jackson, I would love to hear your thoughts. I know you're pastoring a multicultural congregation in Atlanta or Stone Mountain, Georgia. I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I'm actually pastoring a congregation that is multiracial, and the major common denominator is that most of our congregants are experiencing homelessness. Most of them have no place of residence. So when the census worker says, "Where's your address?" It's literally under a bridge in Georgia. And, so I play a crucial role, and I think my congregation and congregations like that. So Black churches and churches across the South, I think, have historically and currently provide a lot of services to people who are experiencing homelessness. We are the ones who are feeding. We're the ones who are mostly running the shelters. And so I want to encourage pastors and faith leaders who are a part of that work to remember that counting people who are experiencing homelessness, who are living on the margins, is just as important as counting the people who are in your congregation in a kind of more traditional way. And that's one of the crucial, I think, critical points. When I think about church and ministry, so much of our ministry actually takes place beyond Sunday morning.
Yes.
Right. We do. Sure. We gathered. Well, before COVID, we gathered on Sunday morning and we praised and worshiped and we praised the Lord. Yeah. But then we also have all of these other ministries. There are after school programs, and all of these things have been modified in some way to continue during COVID. But each one of those persons needs to be counted. And I think oftentimes congregations are actually serving the people that are considered most hard to count. And so a part of our work, when we're handing out those angel food baskets or when we're doing a soup line, it's really important and critical that we encourage folks there to make sure they fill out the census as well.
Yeah, thank you, Reverend Jackson. And I appreciate that. And that's part of the larger conversation I've been having with a lot of faith leaders, is to help us think about how do we double up on our efforts. If you're already doing the soup kitchen, if you're already doing the food pantry, how do you add this layer of census engagement while people are already waiting and standing in line for services? So that makes me, that's a really great pivot, because you use the phrase hard to count. Right. And we often hear that phrase when we're talking about Black and brown communities for all of the reasons that you name: homelessness, displacement, immigration status, even being very mindful of how young children are often considered hard to count, because people sometimes don't think to count their infants that was just born, a month ago. But there's also this kind of insidiousness that I think is important for us to name, is this hard to count, these systemic things, but also the distrust that many groups have with our government, right? So how do we as faith leaders and civic leaders, I would love to hear from you as well, Adele, about the practical side of this. How do we become bridge builders to lessen the burden on the communities to engage? Because I'm always pushing back against is, well, we have to get people out. We have to make sure that they are the ones that's doing it. And I'm like, we're talking about people who are already disenfranchised, people who already have a fear of government, who already have a fear of systems, right? And so how do faith leaders and civic leaders become bridge builders to kind of soften that engagement and really deepen the engagement in meaningful ways? Let me hear from you, Kim.
Yeah, I think so. First and foremost, we need to make sure that the things that we're saying from the pulpit encourage trust when it comes to the census. Now, there are many good historical reasons why, particularly Black folks, do not trust the government. Those we cannot discount. And at the same time, when it comes to us, preaching in front of a screen or however it is that we're doing COVID, we need to make sure that we are encouraging people and talking about the ways that the census, has been a trusted and a safe and confidential place for people to actually disclose that information. Alisha, I appreciate you referencing how people do their ancestral tracing. So the census, it's confidential for 72 years. And that hasn't been breached, right? Like, that has been really consistent. We can look over the years and see how the United States government has actually proven to be trustworthy on that part. And so we need to share that story, right? And I think that another piece of it is for the church to really begin to engage and talk about all of the ways that this stuff just matters. That how you have an overcrowded classroom. Okay, fill out your census, right? You couldn't get your kid into Head Start because it was full. Fill out the census, right? Like, and I can keep filling in, and we are great. We are great at rhetoric. We can preach a good sermon, and I'm sure there's a great rhyme out there that we can create around this. But that's the work that we need to do. We need to be preaching the good news around filling out the census and how that benefits our communities, how it gets money back into our communities. I think specifically about my own neighborhood, and people often talk about how there's not economic development. Nobody wants to engage and develop in our neighborhoods. Well, that stuff is dependent on the census, right? They need to know that there are enough people here who can actually help a development flourish. And then the last thing I want to say is, when it comes to hard to count populations, Alisha, I actually think it's more about we're not willing or not desiring to count them. I think a lot of it has to do with some, I think some of it has some investment in not being interested in putting in the work to count them. And we need to name that. And know we'll get to this at some point around resistance, but I want to remind particularly African Americans about how there was a time where we were just 3/5 of a person, and so let's go and be our full selves. Let's make sure we get counted as a whole person. Every one of us from age birth to no longer there. So those are some of my thoughts around that question.
Thank you. I would love Adele. I would love to hear from you, and then Pastor Luter.
Well, Reverend Jackson brought up so many great points.
She did. Yes.
And covered the gamut on it. And particularly, I think it's when we talk about hard to count, I do agree that, we could probably, there's lots of ways we could call, name that. But when you think about our churches, that's who we are engaging. Those people are, like you said, are the ministries of our church. Often, many times, like the Pastor Luter, you could attest to this, like our ministries when they're giving out food, clothing, many of those people are not our members. They're not, because the ministry goes beyond. And when we're messaging to our congregants and to the people that we engage in our ministries, what we want to do is honor that there is distrust and not say there's not a reason for that. We need to say, that you don't want to say, oh, you're crazy for not trusting. No, you want to honor that by acknowledging that there is a distrust and validating that, but also giving them the facts behind that it is safe and it easy to respond to the census. So we have to kind of do both. We have to honor honor how they're feeling, but also make sure that they know the facts and know that we need to not normalize scarcity. I feel like, and particularly in the South, this is a Southern thing. We have made scarcity look good, sound good, taste good. It shows up in jazz. It shows up in churches, in the choir. It shows up in how we cook. And we make it look, taste, and smell good. And there's a danger, I'm all for it. But there is a danger in that. There's a danger in normalizing scarcity. I've never lived in a community where there were enough Head Start spots, where there wasn't years long waiting lists for Section 8 housing. And I often challenge people to imagine a community where we had enough, for everyone.
Yeah.
Imagine that. But it starts with the census. It starts with first saying, hey, I'm here. If you're not getting counted, you can't hold government accountable, right? You have to first be counted and say you're here.
Yeah. That'll preach, Adele. You sure you're not clergy?
Say amen, somebody. I'm a good student.
Pastor Luter.
I tell you ladies, Reverend Jackson, Adele, y'all have hit on some incredible critical points. Makes me wonder why I'm on this Zoom. Y'all, you didn't need me. You got these experts here, but going back to something Reverend Jackson said, the trust factor. A lot of people don't trust the government. And one of the things that Adele keeps trying to tell me is to share with the people, they can trust the census. I know you may not can trust the governor or the mayor or the congressman because you've seen so many of them do so incredible bad things. But she tried to stress to me, and I try to stress it from the pulpit, you can trust the census. Go back, do a study on it. No one who's ever filled out a census, because people, I don't want those people to know my business. And that's the mentality that, but when you look at the stuff that we miss out on, all of those examples that Reverend Jackson gave in the school and Head Start and other things, when you look at the things that we miss out on because we're afraid of people knowing your business, we need to know how many in your household. We need to know how many people you live with so that we can adequately fund things like Head Start and schools and places for people to stay. And so one of the things that I try to stress is, one, you can trust the census. And the second thing that Adele tried to get, how easy it is to fill out the census. And I did it myself. And I told him it took me 9-10 minutes at the most. And so it's not the whole evening. It's very easy to do. Just 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, 4, and you're finished. And so it's something that we got to just kind of keep on putting into the heads and the minds of our folk that, one, you can trust it, and 2, it's easy to do. And thirdly, it's critical that you do it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Look at you, 3-point preacher. Look at you. So I know good preaching when I hear it. So Reverend Jackson, so you, part of why I'm so glad you're here is that you are towing this line between both the sacred and the secular, right? Your role in running for a Democratic position in Georgia. And so what I would love to hear from you is that part of our work at EPU is to really help Southern communities think about how we shift policies, right, that have historically disenfranchised, marginalized groups. So this, one of the things that I have been talking about on our team at EPU and other faith leaders is about reframing the census as an act of resistance, right? And so when we reframe it that way, it really lends itself to help communities to think about the long-term impact of how responding to the census ensures we have the funding we need for fair and equitable living. So I would love to hear from you from where you sit. How can faith communities position themselves in the conversation about policy, right? A lot of times faith leaders show up in rallies and in these really critical moments, but I'm often wondering how many of us have the opportunity to sit at the table when policies are being created in our communities, right? Because I often think that's where a lot of this stuff begins. So I would love to hear from you from where you sit. How can faith communities, faith leaders position themselves in the conversation about policy, and how do we help our congregations understand what are often complex ideas in really simplified and easy to understand ways?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And it's actually what I really enjoy answering because I think that oftentimes, and this is by design, the policy making process seems very complicated and incredibly hard to access, when in fact, it doesn't have to be that way. And so one of the things I want to encourage people of faith to do is, if you see a problem, so let's say you've been doing an after-school program in your congregation for the last 15 years, and you are seeing that you have children who are constantly coming, who are behind grade level, who are clearly undernourished. Name the problem. So what I want you to encourage you to do is actually pick up the phone and call your legislator, like your state legislator, and tell them that story, because most of our policies actually come as a result of us trying to fix problems, but we can only fix the problems that we are aware of, right? So, a story that I'll tell about my own place right now is I had a constituent who called and said, hey, I have a friend who's on probation because their tag expired and then they couldn't pay the fine associated with having an expired vehicle tag. In Georgia, and this is true in 20-something other states across the nation, having any type of traffic violation is considered a misdemeanor. And so misdemeanors carry with them, you can go to jail for a year or pay $1,000 fine or both. So when to me with this issue of saying, hey, I have a friend who's being surveilled by the state in probation for not being able to pay for her fine for her tags, I immediately began to do the research to talk about, well, what are the solutions to this, right? And that's what we need. The people on the ground, people who are in churches, faith leaders, pastors, we hear the stories, right? I knew that there was a problem with the maternal mortality rate long before I read an article about it, but because I had been burying too many mothers, right? So that's the work to do, and to really empower people to that, we're real flesh and blood. Politicians are real people. Like we are real flesh and blood, and we will respond. And quite frankly, because so few people actually do take the time to reach out, when a constituent does do it, we listen. Yeah. And so I just want to encourage people to take those stories, take the issues that they see, to bring those forward to their legislators.
Yeah, thank you for that. So along those same lines, talking about the census as an act of resistance when we are in such social unrest in this country and what feels like has been for ages, but especially now in the middle of a pandemic and all of the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and there's lots of conversation about resistance. And so this reframing of the census as resistance is important to me because it really gives us a new way of engaging, for at least from a faith leader perspective, that really offers some kind of theological lens. And the other side of the census as an act of resistance is the census as an act of service, right? When we think about offering our service, our due diligence as people of faith, no matter what that faith is, I think all of our religions call for us to act in a way of serving other people. And so, Pastor Luter, I would love to hear from you. What is the theological framing that faith leaders and faith adjacent leaders should have to understand to help parishioners understand this call to serve? Like, what's the theological lens? What is the word that we need to hear to understand the census as an act of service unto other people?
One of the things that I always try to impress upon people is, particularly when you talk about service and servant, is the life of Jesus Christ. He was a person that believed in serving other people. He was one that I know when he was in the garden of Gethsemane praying, and the Roman soldiers came to arrest him. They asked Judas, which one is he? Because they couldn't tell, because he just fit in with everybody. He served people. He served the woman at the well. He served the woman caught in the door. He served everybody. Went to Zacchaeus' house. He served with Lazarus, with Martha and Mary, went to their house. And so one of the things I try to share with our congregation is we have to understand filling out the census is part of our service as citizens of this nation. You know, James Brown had the song years ago, I don't want nobody to give me nothing. Open up the door, I get it myself. That's and right. And I do understand. So, but in order to get it yourself, you got to get involved. You cannot, just like with voting, Reverend Jackson, I don't know what it's always difficult for me when election comes around to convince people, go vote, but nothing's going to change. They're going to do the same thing. No, that's why they keep going, because nobody's voting. You got to go and get those folk out of office and put people in office who going to do the right thing. They got good and bad in there. They got good and bad lawyers, good and bad preachers, good and bad politicians, but you can't just paint everybody with the same brush. So when it comes to service, you got to take personal initiative that I don't care what everybody else is going to do. I'm going to do my part. And so that's what I try to share with people. Just do your part and then try to share with somebody else to do their part. Don't try to, none of us can do it by ourselves, but we're all together can make this work. And part of that is understanding that filling out the census is part of our service as citizens of America.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Go ahead.
I would like to jump in on that a little bit. Just from a personal experience, I'm the mother of some young 20 and teenagers. And so when you're looking at the social unrest, and of course, they're very activist minded and very socially conscious, and I'm very proud of that. And I'm glad that they are. But as they've been wanting to participate and going out to participate in marches and things like that, and I'm talking to them and some of their friends, and I'm saying, well, what's the next step? Like, going out there, showing I'm with you. And, I'm 52, so I was a little afraid to go out there, but I was glad they were representing. 52? I'm 52, yes. But that I was glad that they were out there and expressing themselves and giving voice to that. But I was like, what is the next step? The next step is to show up at the poll and show up at the census, because again, how can we hold government accountable? How do you do that? And you have to look at the processes. So just because some things aren't right, like you said, just because we got some bad preachers and bad politicians, we don't throw out the whole process, right? The process, we have to trust the process and participate until it works, and our benefit. being, and I was saying an act of being silent is a voice, is no voice. You're giving voice to the people who you don't agree with. You're amplifying their voices. And then on the act of service, I mentioned to many of them, because they're all kind of youngish millennials, and I said, do you know that your response could actually impact and ensure that there's another Head Start spot, or that another child gets to participate in the CHIP program or gets Medicaid? So when you're looking, you can't look at it as selfish proposition. You have to look at the collective. And if you want to do collective good, which they do, which they absolutely do, but you have to learn how to express that and know the impact that when you take that 10 minutes, that's you're adding to the pot, and you're ensuring that there is some little Black child in New Orleans that's going to get another spot in Head Start. And you can think of it just that directly. And that I have to say, when I talk to them on those terms, that this is an act of service, it absolutely was a game changer for them. Mm-hmm. So, and I think we do have this a younger generation that there is a lot of distrust. So we have to figure it out. And you guys are the trusted voices. You are the trusted voices. So that's why. So this conversation is so critical, because many people will listen to you when they listen to no one else, when they won't listen to the mayor, the governor, but if Pastor said it,
that's right. That's true.
Oh, I know it.
That's
if
true.
Pastor said it, then it's gospel.
Yes.
Right. Thank you for that. Reverend Jackson, I would love to hear, what's the theology behind this? And I what I hear the undercurrent is, and what I keep thinking about is that as tragic COVID-19 has been, one of the undercurrents of theologically for me has been a reminder of how everything that we do is an act of service to others. Wearing a mask is an act of service to other people. Staying at home stay at home or is an act of service to other people. And so I would love to hear from you as we kind of begin to wrap this up. Like, what's the theological message here when we talk about the census as an act of service?
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally a message of love your neighbor, and to do all that you can to make sure that your neighbor, that your brother, your sister, try to use some inclusive language here, right? That they are cared for well, right? The scripture, and there's lots of scriptures that I can quote here, but they all call for us to be kind to the stranger and to this is the actual translation, to the alien, to the immigrant, to the person who is a non-citizen. And so part of our work of being faithful people is grounded in us completing this census so that our neighbor and ourselves, right, this benefits us too, but so that our neighbors get cared for, so that the immigrants, that people who, in fact, quite frankly, often go uncounted, so that they can receive the services that they need. I think, Paul, the Apostle Paul calls us to a lot of things, but foundationally, I think that the Apostle Paul calls us to loving God and to then loving our neighbor. And, he's echoing Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the frame from which I'm operating out of when I think about the census, is this commitment, this deep connection and commitment to the love of neighbor. And I think if we want to use another analogy from scripture, we can think about also how Paul writes about the body and how each part of the body, each member of the body is equally as important. And so if the eye hurts, then the head hurts. If the hand is harmed, then the foot should weep. And so that's also a part of this, right? That I need to complete my census, but then I need my congregation to complete their census, and I need, their friends, and so on, because we're all part of the same body. I mean, that's the motto of you all, right? Like, out of many, we are one, and we need to know how many we are, so that we can therefore respond and care for each of the individual parts of the entire body.
Thank you for that. That's so good.
Nancy, if I can piggyback on that, one of the things that came to mind when Reverend Jackson was talking about the analogy that Paul gives us in Corinthians about even in Matthew chapter 25, when when Jesus was talking about how we need to care for other people. And that's what filling out the census is about. This, my kids are grown and gone, and my wife don't even look at me by another kid, and I'm at the age, I don't even want to, but I fill it out because there's somebody else's parent, somebody else's son, somebody else's daughter that needs it. And Jesus said that in Matthew 25, hey, when I was hungry, you didn't give me food. When I was starving, when I was thirsty, you didn't give me anything to drink. When I was in prison, you didn't visit me. And they said, wait, time out. When were you hungry? When were you naked? He said, and Jesus said this, as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me. When we fill out the census, we're doing it so that the least of these can get an equal opportunity to benefit from all the things that the census produces.
That's a word. That's a word.
That is a word. That is a word.
And can I add just a little bit that I think is really important during COVID-19 times to really think about is, the census also helps us determine how many hospital beds we need.
Yes.
And
great point.
Right now, Georgia right now, we are 87% capacity for our hospitals. And, that's during COVID times, but I'm also aware, there are 159 counties in Georgia, and there are some counties in which you have to go over 3 counties in order to get medical care after 5 p.m. And that stuff is reflected in the census. So yes, this is about our children and our children's children and about making sure they're Head Start and that there are enough school rooms. But this is also about if you get in a car accident while you're traveling on a back road, which in the South, we got a whole bunch of them. We need to know that there's a hospital, that there's a doctor, right? That there's somebody who can get you some health care that's relatively nearby. And part of how we get there is by you filling out the census and everyone filling out the census so that we know we have enough hospital beds and enough hospitals available for everybody.
That's good.
The data never, the data tells the truth, and the demographics, when we look at how COVID has been affecting different communities and how, the how it's affecting and the who it's affecting.
That's right.
Can absolutely be seen in the data. And that's what we want. We want the data to be able to drive, like Reverend Jackson said, where those dollars, those like COVID response dollars, and in any future crises, because they will happen. They will. One thing we know, they will happen. But if we have the data there, then again, government can respond like it's supposed to, and make sure we have those adequate enough, the medical care, the enough testing, and all of that is used when you hear the government officials saying the data is telling us this, and the data is telling. It's like, where is this data? Well, they're using census data. Yeah. So if we're not all there, then they're not making the best decision for everybody, for everyone.
That's good.
Yeah.
Friends, this has been rich. This has been so good. So the last thing, I just kind of want to leave us with this kind of clarion call. We've talked a lot about the census as an act of resistance, as an act of service. And, I'm a ordained reverend, but I remember, and I am still I'm under the leadership of my pastor. And so I'm a lay person. And so I want to leave this conversation with us offering a call to action to those who are watching. What is the call to action? The one thing that we need our people across, not just the South, which is really dear to us, but across America, what do we need them to hear as a call to action for today? And then we're going to wrap our time together. Adele, we're going to start with you.
Well, I would say respond to the census today. Respond to the census like your healthcare depends on it, because it does. Respond to the census like your children's education depends on it, because it does. Respond to the census like your streets and your roads and your bridges depend on it, because it does. Public safety, because it does. So when you say the call to action is respond to the census, and you can fill in the rest with a lot of different things. So when we say the why, because it does, because it matters. As I think Reverend Jackson said, because census matters.
Thank you for that pivot, Reverend Jackson. What's the call to action today?
Yeah, my call to action is very specifically to those people who find themselves doing service to the people that are often hard to find. So if you are delivering Meals on Wheels, if you are an Angel Food Basket deliverer, you're working a soup kitchen line or any of those types of things, I want you to carry the message, and I want you actually to enable and help. You can pull out your phone right where you are, and you get those folks to help them fill out their census. Absolutely critical. Most people who are watching this, I'm going to bet, have already filled out the census, but there's a high chance that there's someone you know who hasn't. And so please, if you are a person like me who does ministry with people experiencing homelessness, ask them, have you filled it out? Has somebody talked to you? And if somebody hasn't, it's really easy. 10 minutes equals $2,500 per person in the South. Let's get this done. Let's do this for everyone that we know. And hey, if there was a baby that was born in the last couple of months, you make sure they get included too.
Thank you. And Pastor Luter, you have the last word.
Great. Thank you, Reverend Gordon. Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Thank you, Adele. This has been great. I've truly enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. I've been inspired by everything that has been said. But my call to action would be similar to what happened to Jesus in Matthew chapter 9 when he went into this area of the city and said the people he just saw the people just all over, and he was concerned about them because they were going to and fro, having no direction in life. And Jesus was concerned about them. He had compassion for them. And he said, the harvest is truly plentiful, but the laborers are few. It's now time for the laborers in the body of Christ to understand how important it is for us to go out and not only fill out the census ourselves, but encourage other people to fill out the census, simply because the harvest is right, but the laborers are few. We got to do our part. It's one thing to talk about this thing and how important it is, but it's another thing to put actions behind our words. And I just pray that if anything is done today, when people watch this Zoom webinar, they will see the importance of backing up their words with their actions and filling out the census.
Thank you so much, Adele, Reverend Jackson, Pastor Luter. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for watching with us. If you want to learn more about the work we do at EPU, please visit us at www.unumfund.org. Thank y'all so much. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank y'all. Enjoyed it.
It was really great.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.